am Amy Vetter, and welcome to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. This valuable time is for you to pause in your day and go on your own self-journey. Discover the beliefs that are holding you back from living your best life at work and at home. Learn from the guests on this show as they share their inspirational stories on how they found ways to break internal beliefs that were no longer serving them. Because if you believe you can, you will. And our podcast begins now. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs, where I interview Melissa Monte, who is the host of the popular podcast Mind Love. Through her raw stories, personal experience, and inspiring interviews, Mind Love highlights the incredible role of the mind in happiness, health, and success. Melissa is an entrepreneur, yogi, former corporate VP, and self-proclaimed seeker. She has spent the last 16 years exploring methods of improving the human condition and learning what makes us humans tick. During my interview with Melissa, she provides her raw journey from hitting rock bottom to transforming her life by finding happiness from the inside. Now, on this episode, I do want a precursor to this because we do talk about many sensitive topics, including suicide, drug abuse, and rape. So if any of those topics are too sensitive to you, this may be an episode you may want to skip. If you are more interested in these topics of how they affect the people around you, yourself, or the people that you care about, Melissa gives some great tips on how she was able to overcome her own shame and unhappiness by doing intentional things that would help her cultivate happiness from the inside. If you or anyone you love has any issues with the topics that we discussed today, there is a national helpline. It is SAMHSA. It stands for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They have a helpline where you can call them from a national basis to find a place near you to get help. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs. Today, I'm here with Melissa Monte. And Melissa, do you want to give a little background on yourself?
Yeah, so I have a podcast called Mind Love, and the journey to getting here was pretty intense. There's a lot of self-exploration, I think, that happens when you start to really come to terms with your purpose. And so it's either the story that you're creating or the background that speaks to that, or maybe that's how it was supposed to be this whole time. So that's really what I've been figuring out. I was a really good kid. I was an honors student. I had all the potential in the world. And then when I got to college, I squandered what I thought all of my potential was. I made mistake after mistake after mistake, and ended up in a position where I was heavily bulimic. I was doing party drugs like 5 nights a week. I was in terrible relationships that one that even landed me in jail for a while.
Wow.
And then all of a sudden I was like, well, now what do I do? Not only have people say you have an eating disorder for your whole life. And I was like, so I've somehow broken my brain. I now have a criminal record. And now, what am I supposed to do to get a job? I had really expectation life hard because, if I never thought I was going to be anything, maybe it would have been an easier pill to swallow. But, so at a point where I reached my absolute rock bottom and thought I just wanted to press the reset button on my entire life, I realized that either I could do that or I could climb my way out of this mess and find some sort of meaning in it. So it took me years and years, and the meanings evolved over time. But now I'm just so thankful for everything that led me to this because of everything that I've been through, I've been able to relate to so many more people than I would have been able to before. And, I have a lot of tools of coping with whatever life throws at me.
Well, and I think, why I thought it was so important for you to be on this podcast is because of your story. I think a lot of people that end up, pivoting along the way down the wrong paths, whether intentionally or unintentionally, can feel like life's over. And these belief systems that we create in our head can get in the way of our potential. And you are such a great example of really living to your potential. And so I want to actually start backwards and come back to when you were young. So you said you were an honor student. What did you dream that you were going to be when you grew up?
Well, depends what age you asked me at. If I was
Okay.
3, I would have been a baby animal trainer.
Okay.
I always thought I was going to be a baby animal trainer and a writer, actually. But I remember when I was about 11 years old, my dad signed me up for an acting class because I loved being the center of attention. I still do, to be honest with you. And so if there was like something going on at a birthday party and the clown was like, can I take a volunteer? I was the first one to shoot my hand up.
Right.
And so I was like, well, it makes sense. I'll go do this acting class. And there was a play at the end of it. And I remember after my first class, I told my dad, I was just not in the spirits he thought I was going to be in. He's like, what's wrong? You got to be on stage all day. And I said to him, well, it's weird pretending to be somebody else. I feel like I have my own story to tell. Why can't I be on stage and be me? And that was the first hint of me becoming a public speaker. And so even when, I've gone up and down with everything that I was doing, I was an enrollment counselor for a school for a while. I got into digital marketing about a little over 10 years ago. I worked for startups as vice president, all this stuff. And I was doing all this while going through the worst times of my life. So I was really able to balance like looking like I had things together while inside I was just crumbling.
Well,
But
how did you do? I think that's important because, we're at work every day with, our coworkers, maybe people that work for us, and we see the outside. So how were you able to hold down a regular job, with everything else that was going on in your life? What were you doing?
I mean, during the times I had a regular job, I was just partying about 5 nights a week. So it was like I needed to escape. I've always been also really good at hacking the system. So I remember when I had a job as an enrollment counselor, I basically filed a complaint with like HR and said that I needed my own office because I had ADD and people were distracting around me. Did I really need my own office? Probably not, but I was just really good at like, what was the end result that I needed to get? Even in college, I went to disabled student services and I really used ADD to my advantage.
Wow.
And I think that's part of the reason that they're not allowed to get mad at you when you don't
Right.
when you don't attend class. They can't grade you on your attendance. And so I would realize the little life hacks about how to get what I wanted. And it's really funny because I did that even with like, why did I take so much Adderall for so long? Because it seemed like a miracle drug and it was a little hack. But in finding these little hacks, what I was doing was skipping a ton of development. So all of my hacks did catch up to me eventually.
Right.
Like I had to learn when I became an entrepreneur, I had to learn like all these hacks are just going to be a disservice for me.
Exactly.
They worked when I was working for somebody else, but for me, it was doing me a disservice. And so, but I was at a point where I thought I was the happiest that I had ever been when I was making really good money for a company I was working for. I was able to get everything done. I think honestly, like employees aren't working the full 8 hours anyways. So I was able to like just being super efficient during a 3-hour window and then doing whatever I wanted the rest of the time. And I was still over delivering. I was good at doing that. Well, what's interesting though is that as much as I thought that I was happy during that time, and I was saying I was the happiest I'd ever been, I loved my roommate, made a lot of money, I was also partying 5 nights a week and doing party drugs, not treating my body very well, and like pushing myself through everything. And I think the universe will often set you back and force you to face the reality that you're in denial of. And so all of a sudden I found out my landlord was selling our place. My company was shutting down during a 1-week window. And then I crashed my car during a 3-day window of not having insurance.
Oh,
and
geez.
So everyone around me was like, how are you not freaking out? But I had already hit my solid rock bottom. And this was still during my climb out,
Yeah.
like everyone expects you to hit rock bottom and change everything around. Well, I changed some things around. I didn't change all the things. And suddenly, that it was interesting because that was in December. I ended up having to move, and I ended up meeting my husband that week in Big Bear and kind of moving up there, quieting my life down. And he was the person that was also on a growth path. And so it was able to kind of reconcile these two worlds, like one world where I was like pretending to be this spiritual yogi, but then also like pissing it away in the evenings. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden I was able to like, surround myself with people that were on the path that I really wanted to be on. So it was like the last step for me. So leads us to now.
So if I'm your boss, just put yourself in the leader's shoes. So how would they have noticed something was off? Like what would have been the cues for them? Because I think a lot of times, everyone has these fronts, but in order for really true progress to happen in business and so forth, we have to pay attention individually what's happening with our team members. And, sounds like you really had a call for help, even though you were going through all of these, having fun. But what could they have noticed that they didn't notice or have helped you during that time?
So what I find very interesting about this is part of the reason I was able to get away with what I was getting away with was because I was partying with my boss.
Oh, wow. Well, there you go.
And so I think there's really something to be said about setting the example that you want to be shining through your company.
Yes.
Because how are you going to realize that I didn't realize that what I was doing was numbing a lot of my life. I thought I was just living it up. And it's really easy to be in denial of the things that we're not ready to face yet. And he was doing the same thing. And so it caused a pretty toxic relationship even at work, because it was difficult to really respect somebody when they were telling me to do something when I had just seen them do a line of coke off their bathroom counter the night before. You know what I mean? So that was something that I talk about a lot, was even overcoming that situation, because I put myself in that situation as well. That toxic environment caused me to put up with a lot of things that I wouldn't have put up with. He was definitely a toxic boss to everybody because he was going through his own stuff. And so if you're not facing your problems, it's going to leak out in all the areas of your life.
Right. And I think, there's moments where, and like you said, like you had all these signs, things are crashing down, but prior to that, there's signs of, I need to accept what's going on around me, and if this is the life I want to live. So besides, the car crashing and everything else, like from a human perspective, so you set out originally, in college to be successful and so forth. And how did you get off track? Like, what were the signs like during it where you decided to go against your gut of, that I know that I'm going against who I want to be, and I'm going to push that aside right now?
What happened was that it was more of a discovery of that. It wasn't necessarily that I knew that that's what I was doing. It's that I had a pretty charmed life growing up, and not a lot of bad things happened to me. And then within a few year period of time, I was raped, I lost a friend to suicide, and I lost my dad. And so when those things all happen at once, it was hard for me to find meaning from one to the other. Suddenly I started to it was like, oh, this is life as an adult. This is what I have to deal with now. And I identified with those things for too long, or I felt like a victim in my own circumstances. And when I felt like a victim, then it was hard to take control over anything else that I wanted to do, if that makes sense. And so what had to happen was I had to start finding evidence that I could turn this around. And that's why it was so slow for me, is because I identified with those things so much. It was like yoga. Suddenly I was there for fitness, but all these little things that I was hearing started to infiltrate. I was given a good book, and not all of it did I internalize, but maybe one thing. So it was one thing at a time, and I would take one step out of the gutter each time. And then eventually, because of my actions, I started building evidence towards a new self-image.
Right. And it's really important that we are aware of the people around us and our communities around us, because as you were going through all those tragedies, there had to have been people seeing, oh my God, Melissa, is going off the deep end right now, right? Like there's some shift, and it's hard being the people around, because I mean, I've been impacted by drug abuse in my own family, and I know that as a family member, you can't do it for the person.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, then the hacks happen, where they think they're getting away with it, but the person that is sober knows exactly what they're doing. So, and unfortunately, during those periods, it's like, how do the two sides come together to still have compassion for what someone's going through? But, I can tell you from the family member perspective, I think what's hard in those situations is I am the one sober, so I remember everything. And the person that's not sober doesn't. And so it's easier for them to come back the next day and say, oh, I'm sorry that happened, or, this issue happened, and you still have these images in your head, So how would you handle that if that was in your life with somebody else, and you see someone like you, going down this path? Are there ways that, because of what you've been through, that you would reach out?
Yes, and it is going on with members of my family, unfortunately, and it's really hard on all of us. And one thing that I notice is my perspective with it is a little bit different than my mom's, for instance.
Yeah.
And when I was going through everything, I was a mover. I moved around a lot when things got hard. So, and I just have a really bubbly personality. So I was really good at faking what I was feeling. And I think part of it was because I was taking things to override what I was actually feeling. So I looked happy to the people on the outside.
Totally. Yeah.
But somebody like my mom knew. And her instinct was to say certain things that would actually push me further away. And it was like giving those lectures and trying to be that mirror, like, this is what you did last night. This is how you weren't yourself. And all that did was push me away even more, because either I was forced to internalize the shame being placed upon me. It was like, that was my option: internalize that or deny it. And it was easier to deny. So now when I'm watching some other family members go through this, a lot of my family members' reactions to this one particular member are to do those same things. Like they don't realize that they're shaming them, but they are. Since I've gone through it, my perspective is so different. And I know that those things didn't work for me. And unfortunately, a big part of it is allowing them to go through it. But I think there's a few things that have been really helpful that I also learned from, I used to be a suicide and crisis counselor. I was the person that you'd call on the emergency line if you were in crisis or you wanted to kill yourself. And you learn a lot of the things in that situation, because it's one of the most dire situations. And what it is it's never about, this is what I would do, this is how you should do it, this is what I see that you're doing wrong. It's about asking them questions that come to their own conclusions, that allow them to see the perspective that they're currently turning the lights off for. And one of those is first of all, getting them to come to terms with the things that they're actually doing, how they're actually feeling, by just asking questions they're kind of leading questions. Like, you want them to be blunt with what they're doing. In the example of suicide, you want them to say, like, so how far have you gotten to the point of planning to kill yourself? And the way that this applies in a less severe situation is like, well, what are you really doing right now? Like, what are you, like, getting them to identify, like, what are you trying to hide? Or what is it
what are your actions?
Yeah, what is the root of this? And also, where does it lead to? So that was a big shift in overcoming my eating disorder also. If I continue these behaviors, not what do I look like and feel like tomorrow, which might be thinner or whatever I was in denial of, because it was never that. It's like, what does that look like in 40 years? Like, what are you trying to create with your current actions?
What's your goal?
Yeah. And getting people to be really blunt about that. Like, what you're doing now, what does that lead to? Yeah. And how do you have a conversation with compassion in your voice rather than judgment? And that's such a hard shift, especially if you haven't been through it, because you don't know the toll that it is. So it's somehow finding the compassion with yourself to really put yourself in these shoes. And instead of saying like if somebody really had the control over their actions that you do, they wouldn't be doing these self-destructive things. And just that awareness that you might not understand what they're going through is a really important thing to come at that perspective with.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you stay? So you've shifted, right? Like coming back to, how would you describe your belief system now versus then?
Is that I have one.
Yeah.
Before, again, I let so many things I didn't know what it meant to create my self-image from the inside out. And so
Mhm.
instead, and I think this is natural too, like when you're in high school, what's cool? What do you want for Christmas? It's half the time the things that your friends want. Like, what style is yours? It's because you heard that this was cool.
Right.
And then nobody really shifted me out of that. Like, nobody taught me to how to find my values, how to figure out my legacy. And I was even afraid to commit to certain things because I didn't know for sure. And so I think part of it is pulling the threads at what brings you joy now, the things that you do know, and pull the threads on those, explore those a little bit. And so through doing that, I'm still figuring out who I am. But right
Yeah.
now I
That's a
know
life
that,
journey.
yeah, and it's always going to evolve. But now I have a pretty good handle on, at least for the moment, what makes me happy, when I'm lit up, what my boundaries are, which is super important. I had no boundaries before. So if somebody asked something of me, I was just going to do it half the
Right.
time. And now it's just coming from a different place. And so now I know that I need to come at life from the inside out instead of from the outside in.
Yeah. And really setting those personal goals or purpose for yourself. I think what I'm hearing is like, what's the longer term objective of, where you want to be and how do you see yourself? So if you're going to get there, what are the little steps you have to do today and next year and the year after, that it's just not going to happen like that? Because I know, disappointment happens a lot of times in careers just because it's not happening right away, or you're not a famous actress right away. And another thing I think that you said, which, if you kind of pull the threads, like you said, you actually knew who you were when you went to act and didn't enjoy it as much and you wanted to be yourself. And when you can tap back into those childhood, like natural tendencies that come to you, like,
Mhm.
how do you pull that into adulthood now?
Yeah, I have actually recently been finding even more clarity by an exercise that I recently did. I was just journaling, and journaling's so helpful because sometimes it gets, and I'm not the kind that actually found journaling to come really naturally. It's been
Right.
a habit that I've been cultivating because I have seen such value from it, because suddenly whatever's in my head is on paper, and it's this automatic way to shift a perspective. It's just out of your head and onto paper. So you're seeing it as like this fact, and then you can question it in a way instead of allowing that subconscious to drive you. So one thing that I've been doing recently is like writing out what were think of all my happiest times in life. What did those things have in common? And really, what feelings did I have during that time? And so
Yeah.
many times we're like looking for this exact action to lead us to where we're going. But what if we focused on the feelings? Like, what did all of those feelings have in common? Was it adventure, wonder, excitement, thrill? And then how can I make my decisions from that place? Like, if you're trying to figure out, should I be a public speaker, or do I want to start a blog, or do I want to manage a team? Visualize what each of those would be in as much detail as possible, and then figure out what feelings it evokes. And is that
Mm-hmm.
one of the feelings that you're trying to cultivate? Or is that, and a lot of times you'll realize like, oh, maybe I only wanted to be a famous actress because I thought that that's what people would think was the coolest, or I thought that's what
Right.
other people would be most impressed by, or that is the top of the chain on this current career path that I'm going down. But that might not always be what lights us up the most, or what really drives our own motivation. And so to get in touch with the feelings that we want to feel and how to cultivate that through our actions has been really life-changing for me.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think also, so if your end goal is a certain energy level, no matter where you begin, you don't get to do that right at the beginning. So sometimes you have to keep that in your mind of like, you start out in your career, well, you're going to do some grunt work that you probably don't enjoy, in order to eventually achieve that feeling and keep checking in with yourself. Am I getting closer? Am I getting closer? But if you know the end game of why you're doing what you're doing, then even when you're doing stuff you don't really enjoy, but you understand where it's going to lead you, it can help you get to that end game place.
Yeah, I agree completely. And there was a moment actually where I was working for my last company and it was still the toxic boss, only I had made a lot of shifts afterwards. Like we started to evolve a little bit, but it was still kind of toxic. And it was really hard for me to work there. And I knew that that's not what I wanted to do anymore. And there was even a few month period of time where I started my podcast on the side. And so there's a few different things that I learned from this. Number one is I think it's still important to figure out how to cultivate those feelings that you want the end goal right now. Like, how can you bring that in? That's why people say there's so much power in having gratitude for what you have now, and then moving into your actions from that higher energy place. But there was a lot of power in starting my passion on the side. And it doesn't have to be the thing. Like for me, it ended up pivoting to a whole new career path. But for some people, they might volunteer at their kids' Girl Scout camp, or my husband actually volunteers at a kids camp. We don't have kids, but he volunteers at a kids camp every single year, and it's one of his favorite things, and it has nothing to do with his career. And so that helps him to have the balance during the grunt work.
Yes.
The second thing is, what is it that you're doing right now? Like, it's so easy to get caught in everything about this is mundane. I don't like this job, and this isn't what I'm going to be doing in my future. But why? What can you take from that right here, right now, that's going to help in your future? So during that interim of realizing, like, having the seeds of what I wanted to do with Mind Love and still working at this job, I realized I work at a startup. There's a lot of hats that I can wear. How can I position myself in the company to be cultivating the skills that are needed for my purpose later on? What do I have access to here? Maybe it's the ad budget, or maybe it's the team that I'm managing, or whatever that's going to help me over here. And to find the alignment in whatever ways you can will give you a different perspective on the current tasks that you're doing.
Absolutely. So how have you seen the changes you've made in your life affect those around you, whether it be people you work with, whether it be friends or family?
There's a lot. One of the biggest turning points for me with that company and realizing that now was the time I needed to make a change, and it was a few months later that I started the podcast on the side, was when I realized that my unhappiness was affecting not just me, but my relationship. And so then not just the relationship as an entity, but the person I was in a relationship with. And so if you allow yourself to be bogged down by all of your disappointment in your life, energy is contagious, whether you believe that in the woo-woo way or just in life. If you are around like your angry mother every single day, it's going to be hard not to let that affect you. And so I've realized so much that it's not selfish to turn inward and to focus on myself. It's the best thing that I can do for everybody around me, because not only am I a more pleasant person to be around in those tight-knit things, but when you see somebody accepting responsibility for their life and then leading from this place of light or the place of passion, that's really inspiring to other people. Some of the people that made the greatest impact on my life, it's just because they were being unapologetically themselves and fiercely following their own passions. So since I've been able to do that, I mean, it's when you have a platform, like I have a podcast, so like tens of thousands of people are listening to it every single day. But even just the people that see me that don't listen to my show, they see a different light in me because I've chosen my joy over everybody else's.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to just emphasize, to not feel guilty. Because you're right. Like, you take your energy from one experience into another. And if you don't take those moments to pause and go, what is my intention of how I want to show up in a meeting with a friend, with a family member, and ensure that you're proud of how you left that experience, it makes you feel better overall than letting people affect you and then you're responding and then not happy with yourself after, right?
Yeah, and the way you live, if you have kids and you're the type of person that puts everybody before, and that's how you think being a good person is, guess what? Your kid's going to do that, and they're not going to focus on their light. The people
Right.
around are going to think that's the expectations of them. When you give yourself permission to do what is going to light you up the most, it's what helps other people give themselves permission to live the life that they really want instead of what's expected of them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I like to end with some rapid questions. So you pick a category. So it's family or friends, spiritual, money, or health. Which category?
Spiritual.
Okay. So things or actions that I don't have that I want.
Things or actions that I don't have, but I want. I've been really cultivating the connection with spirituality there through my journey of life. I was raised religious and then I fell away from that. And so much of what I thought was me finding the truth was actually me turning off the spiritual world completely and not really thinking there was anything beyond this, which took away a lot of meaning for me. So now in the
Right.
last few years, it's redefining spirituality on my own terms rather
Mm-hmm.
than what I was fed by one book or one belief system or one thing, and realizing that just because that was hard for me and I had to say no to that, I didn't have to say no to absolutely everything else. So what does it look like for me? Where do I get the most value from that connection? So that's something that I'm still currently working on.
That's great. All right. So things or actions that you do have that you want.
That I do have. I have really, really upped my meditation practice in the last year. I meditate usually at least once a day, unless something big is happening. And that's just been so helpful for me, not even just with that spiritual side. It's not even just as spiritual, but just the amount of processing and mind clearing that happens when you find stillness. I notice a huge difference when I wake up and the first thing I do is check my phone and I'm looking on social media. What I've done right then is immediately infiltrate all of my thoughts with what's important to everybody else. And to
Right.
start the day with own priorities, I have a 9, is just really healing because I get to start it with what's important to me. What am I grateful for? Where's stillness for myself first? And it's almost like it recharges my energy. And then I go into the day from a completely new perspective.
So how long do you meditate each day?
Usually 20 minutes,
Okay.
um, but minimum 12. There's certain
Yeah.
days like I love binaural beats. I think it just like drops me in immediately and I'll be like in another realm. So I
Oh,
use an
okay.
app called Insight Timer. It definitely has the best free plan of any meditation app. And yeah, I drop in and it's pretty amazing.
Cool. All right. So things or actions I don't have that I don't want as far as your spirituality.
I don't want to feel boxed in. I don't want to feel like there's rules, and I don't want to feel led by fear over love. So that's a really important thing that's shifted my own beliefs, is like, what are the teachings of this, and what is the feeling that it's trying to create? Is it fear and power, or is it love and expansion? So for me, I focus on love and expansion.
Love it. All right. And last question, things or actions that I do have that I don't want as far as my spirituality.
I'm still working on sometimes identifying with different things. So there was a lot that I overcame. And even just recently, a revelation that I had was that through creating, there was a self-image I had 10 years ago, and then there's a completely different one that I have now that's much more empowered. But what happened in overcoming that is that I started to look at my past self with shame. It was like I was
Mm,
ashamed of who I was, and I started to recreate even other stories, like maybe if I was this bad to myself, I must have been a bad friend. I must have been a bad roommate. And I
mm.
recently reconnected with somebody from college who I hadn't spoken to in almost 15 years. And he wants me to be an advisor for his company, which is really interesting. And it was funny because I was like, why me and why now? And he's been kind of following my journey. And he's just like, well, I've worked with a lot of people. And he said, and there's just something really consistent about you. and I'm reminded of how good of a person you've always been. And suddenly I was snapped out of this story that I had created about my past self. And I realized that I was identifying with that too. So even as we shape our stories and as we
Yes.
evolve, don't box yourself into like this one view of yourself. There are so many different ways that you can look at every single story that we're telling. So always choose the most empowering one.
I love that. Yeah. So, what do you want people to walk away with as your message, your biggest takeaways from this conversation, and anything you want them to know about the things that you do as well?
My biggest message that I'm discovering about myself is actually just that, is discover yourself, allow yourself the flexibility, be intentional about who you create, because that self-image is going to drive your actions and even who you become in the future. And so often I was either numbing or seeking outside of myself for my own satisfaction and wondering why I always felt so empty. So take the time to discover your triggers and to create the boundaries that you're comfortable with. And in the beginning, it's going to seem crazy. That's why so many people are like, I don't even know what my passion is. And it's because we
Right.
haven't started to pull the threads of our passion and to say, oh, maybe all I know right now is that I like to cook, but I am a financial analyst. What do you do? Start cooking. Like, what do you get from
Right.
that? How can you expand that? What else does that lead to? Take a culinary class, find other people that are interested in this. What are they doing with their lives? And so you might not know immediately, but just dive into the clues that you get about yourself. And the more that you're living from that place, the more doors will open up. And it might take a year or 2 or 3, but you're going to find so much clarity on how to take your next step if you first start with discovering who you are.
And have fun
Yes,
along the
have
way.
fun. Definitely.
It's
That's
fun
the
to
best
learn
part
about
about
yourself.
chasing joy, is that
Yeah.
you're in joy all the time.
Don't stress yourself out about it.
Yeah, for
Exactly.
sure.
So, you want to tell people where they can find you and the things that you do?
Yes, I have a podcast called Mind Love. Every week, I interview somebody else with a story to tell and a lesson that they've learned in their own life. So you can find me on any podcast platform by searching Mind Love, 2 words, or mindlove.com. And then I'm always sharing inspirational messages on Instagram every day at mindlovemelissa.
Great. All right. So thank you so much for being on today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think everyone will benefit from some of the lessons that you shared. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now let's take some time for the mindful moments of this podcast. And I honestly had many. I'm sure all of you that listened had some for yourself. And I do think taking some time to pause after a conversation like this is important. If not only for yourself, but people that may be affected by some of the things that Melissa talked about that are around you, that you work with, or that you care about. And one of the things that we talked about were ways that you may be able to notice when someone might be in trouble, where you saw that Melissa was really able to create a great front as far as the people around her at work and still be achieving while all of these things were happening in her personal life. And she called it hacking the system. And she used it in order to help her continue down the path she was going without anyone else noticing. And how she was able to use things in the workplace from an HR standpoint, or making sure that her friends or family didn't notice things that were going on, in order to continue the behaviors that were unhealthy for her. And really, until she got to a point of where things started to kind of collapse, whether it be at work or her apartment, and so forth, that it really brought her to a place of doing that self-exploration to see if this was the path she really wanted to continue. And when she took those steps back in her life, she ended up, without maybe wanting to, seeing new glimmers of hope for herself. And I think a lot of times we think when we need to transform, it's big things that we have to do. And a lot of times it's just the little things in our everyday life where we just become more observant, whether that being just grateful for the sun coming up that day, or going to yoga, or finding some exercise regimen that helps you breathe a little bit or gives you some relief, or maybe it's painting or knitting or taking pictures. It doesn't have to be something active, but where your mind can shift from its current situation. And I think that's really important, no matter if it's as serious as the things that Melissa was going through. There's really no temperature on pain. That we can't say one person's pain is worse than another, because we all have our own individual journeys that we're going on. And we need to be really sensitive to ourselves and give ourselves compassion to go on that journey of getting ourselves healthy. And it could be something much less serious than what Melissa is talking about on this episode. Now, another big area for me, and you heard me talk about it with Melissa, is this has affected my family of having a family member that was a drug addict. And it is a really hard thing when you're the person to support or try to get that person help. And a lot of times, at least for me, I have found that there's not a lot of people talking about the people around people that are in these addiction situations and how to get yourself help and how to make sure that you are not enabling behavior or pushing someone further down a path. Where you heard Melissa talk about that when her family members would come to her and tell her that she needed to change or think about what she's doing, instead she was denying. And I know for myself, this is a really hard thing. And as you heard me say on the podcast, that, the people that are sober, the people, and it may not be drug addiction, it could be, physical abuse, emotional abuse, whatever. When the person that's inflicting that to the people around us, because it's just like we talked about, that energy that we all take in from somebody else, when they're feeling better, it's hard for the caregiver to feel better at that point, because you don't know when the other shoe's going to drop. I recently was speaking at a conference about these internal stories that we carry with us, because what happens is that not only is the person that you care about affected, but you're affected. These become your stories as well. The people that are the caregivers, the people that want those people to feel better, and you want them to get better. And so the people around those people that are having these hardships a lot of times don't feel like it's their story. But when we actually tap back and realize these internal stories that we are carrying are actually affecting us, whether it be at work, at home, and different fears that we may cultivate inside of us because we're afraid of other people around us going down that same path because we've seen it before. After this session at this conference, I had an audience member come up to me and tell me about their own brother that had died of an overdose, and how that has affected him and how he's had to keep, moving forward in his career without anyone seeing what's really going on the inside. So I really surfaced this issue because it's a hard thing from both sides. And we obviously need to get help for the people that are going through any kind of addiction or mental breakdowns or depression or so forth. But we also have to take care of ourselves as caregivers of the people around us, to make sure that we don't go down a path that we don't want to as well. So when she was talking about to not feel guilty when you do that self-care for yourself, I think that's really important because, like I said in the beginning, a lot of times we are so focused on what somebody else is going through that we don't necessarily take care of ourselves, or we might feel guilty taking care of ourselves because their situation in our heads might feel that much worse. But each of us is on our own individual journey, and it is our jobs to take care of ourselves so that we can be better for the people around us. And so those little things that Melissa shared of not trying to do huge things in your life, but to really understand and cultivate the happiness from within. What are the things that you can remember that made you happy, even if it was just a fleeting moment? What are the things, but really attached to that feeling where you just felt that sense of freedom or release? And then trying to find the activities or the things in your life where you can get those glimmers of release and joy again. And it's really important that we figure out what are those things in our work life, what are those things in our family life, and what are those things of just side hobbies or time for ourselves, so that we don't look at ourselves like this is what defines us. What defines us is our own intuition, our own energy that we want to cultivate. And another point that she said in there was to make sure that you're not looking at your past self with shame. And that can be on both sides of the coin, is that we don't look back and doubt any choices that we made. We understand that all of these choices brought us to the place that we are at, and appreciate that present moment so that we can actually move into the future in the way that we want, creating the energy that we want to create for the people around us.
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. I hope you will take a moment to pause before entering back into your day to reflect on this podcast and note 1 to 2 actions you are inspired to do from today's conversation that you could incorporate into your life. To read the full blog and listen back to this episode or any other, you can find them at www.amyvetter.com/Breaking Beliefs podcast and related videos on my YouTube channel. For daily inspiration, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Amy Vetter CPA. I hope that you will choose to like this and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and more, so that you can join us for more inspiration on our next episode.